Hello, good morning. Hopefully you can hear me all right. Welcome to this week's DMA webinar, this week sponsored by Royal Mail Marketreach, who I'm sure you're all familiar with as the body that champions mail, the mail channel, both customer mail from letters from your bank and from your doctors, from your utility, and also the addressed marketing mail that comes through your letterbox. So that's this week's sponsor. My name's Richard Armstrong. I'm a partner at an agency called MSQ Sustain, and I'm going to help facilitate the next hour. And I'm joined by some experts in the field to help me do that. But before we get to them, I thought I'd start with a question. It's a rhetorical question, so you don't need to answer this. But if you imagine I stopped 100 people in the street and asked them if they agreed or disagreed with the statement that paperless is good, paperless is better for the planet, and paper by default is bad for the planet. I wonder what the statistics would show. I think that would be in the high 90s, I'm pretty sure, in terms of people's. What if there were 100 marketeers or media agency people asked the same question? What do you think the answer would be? Is this true? Is the question. Is this an assumption that I think we might want to challenge? Is this a question that we think might bear further scrutiny? I think there's in that assumption there's a sense that digital is somehow footprint free, and that it is the magical solution to avoiding any carbon footprint. But on the other hand, in the packaging industry, we laud and approve of all the move from plastics to paper and cardboard, and yet it's not quite the same when it comes to mail. So the question that we're going to look at today is, can mail be a sustainable option? Can mail contribute to a circular economy? And I think it's a really relevant question to be asking, because whether you're a media planner or a chief marketing officer, you're making decisions about where to invest your media. Obviously, the criteria: does it work? Will it be effective? How much does it cost? Can I reach my audience? But increasingly, how sustainable is this media selection is becoming a key part of those criteria. So to help look and explore this question a little further in depth, I'm joined by four panelists. James Cannings, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of MSQ Group, but is also here as the co-chair of the Sustainability Council at BIMA, the British Interactive Media Association. James, just give us a wave so we know where you are. There we are. Hi, James. Then we're also joined by Charles Jarrold, who is the CEO of BPIF, the British Printing Industry Federation, and knows an awful lot. We often hear about FSC and wood and the source material, but this is a huge part of the supply chain in mail around printing and production. And Charles is going to be able to tell us a little bit more about some of the innovation happening there. We're also joined by Hannah Casey, who's an expert from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which I'm sure you're all familiar with as the leading voice and authority on the circular economy. So thank you, Hannah. And finally, Phil Ricketts, who's the Commercial Director of Royal Mail Letters Division and has oversight over the Marketreach body as well. So can mail be a sustainable option? And our agency, MSQ, was approached by Royal Mail Marketreach last year with this very question. How can we look at it? And I think the question was asked in all sincerity and full transparency. How do we think about mail? How can we assess whether it's a sustainable option in that way? And to answer that question, quite rightly, Marketreach said, we've got to start with some data. And they commissioned, in what is quite a unique study, WSP, to do a full life cycle assessment of a whole range of typical mail formats, and to calculate across the entire life cycle, from the raw materials through the printing and production, the creative, the delivery, and then the end of life of those mail formats, to assess the carbon impact of each of the different formats or typical formats that might be used. And I think it starts with data. And I think once we'd looked at that data, it started to tell quite an interesting story, because when you sort of pull back the aperture on a mail and don't just see it as the thing that comes through your door, there's actually a whole life cycle to it. It starts to sort of reveal quite an interesting story about not just the raw materials that are coming from a regenerative crop, if you like, in terms of trees and forestry, but also into all the reinvention and innovation that's happening in the industry, which is quite innovative, from biodegradable inks and alternatives to plastic, etc. There's a lot of energy has been put in the last few years into that process of reinvention. At the same time, what Royal Mail are doing in terms of reducing their carbon, electrifying the fleet, and decarbonising their business across the whole organisation is fascinating. And then finally, what I didn't quite appreciate until we got into it was just the levels of recycling in the UK, and the number of times that paper fibres can be recycled, reused, and then go on to have a new life thereafter. So it becomes quite an interesting story about what there's more to mail than perhaps we would have thought. And those, you may have seen that Marketreach have recently started to promote access to that data and to some of those findings to help marketeers make good decisions about how to make their mail a little bit more sustainable and how to tap into what's been called the circular advantage of mail. And at the end, I'll come back and I'm going to show you how you can get access to some of that data, how you can get access to some of the guides about how to make mail a little bit more sustainable. So without further ado, if I come out of those slides, or Sean, you can help me come out of those slides. I wanted to firstly turn to you, James, as an authority on all things digital, and really pose a question. Does digital, is it really footprint free? Does it have any footprint? Is it, or does it run on unicorn breath, as some people say?
It's nothing's footprint free, nothing in life's free. I think, you know, I'm not going to attempt to answer the question, but to help sort of just give some headline stats to help you think about it, because I think my job generally with BIMA and MSQ is really about helping awareness about digital footprints and what we can do about them, because they are huge, or collectively they are huge. I think there is more awareness. There's certainly some headline stats that have been flying around for a while, but if you're not aware, the internet as a whole has a larger carbon footprint than the aviation industry, about 3% and rising. So we all get in a big flap about airlines, rightly so, and they're a big problem, but actually they're not as big a problem as the internet. The airlines' carbon footprint is in decline at the moment, and digital is certainly rocketing up. It will certainly be much larger than the aviation industry, depending how we measure it. It is incredibly complicated to calculate. I often talk about it potentially being easier to land back on the moon, but in simple terms, it's not about data centers. That stat is sometimes misquoted as data centers have that level of carbon emissions. That's typically because when, you know, the press will often be looking at AI and Bitcoin and blockchain and things like that get in the press. And when you're talking about those types of technologies, they're very server intensive, and it can be all about the data centers. But actually what we're talking about, when you think about it, it's not very surprising. We're talking about 4.5 billion people who have access to the internet, making trillions of interactions. And that means, of course, that the profile of the footprint is very, very different to the aviation industry. It's fun to compare it, but, you know, there we stop. But the point is, it's not data centers, it's data transfer. Right, it's billions of people making trillions. All of those Instagram posts that you load, Facebook, websites that you go on, YouTube videos that you stream, they don't magically appear on your device. They come through the world's networks, fiber optic networks, routers, repeaters, satellites, 4G, 5G. All of these things require power. Just to sort of put it into numbers, into something that might mean to you, if we accept the methodologies, and there are competing ones, and I won't go into why it's so complicated. It's partly to do with, you know, calculating, you know, grid emissions factors in individual countries in real time to work out how much, you know, that data transfer actually costs. But if we use a load of averages, around about a gigabyte of data transfer is about 400 to 800 grams. I mean, I appreciate everybody knows what a gigabyte is, but we, you know, used to big hard drives and uploading and flinging big things around, streaming videos. That would certainly be, you know, a typical movie would be bigger than that on Netflix. That's about the same as flying 4 to 8 miles on the 747. Okay, so it's quite a lot when you think about a 747. Obviously, that assumes that the 747 is full and not just you on it. Or, just to put it a bit more context, we recently measured a large telco website in the UK. This is made up of about 1 billion views, right? It was a big company. They get a lot of hits on their website, but it's not lots of video. It's about 3,500 tons was the carbon footprint just of that website, which is the equivalent of about 20 million air miles. And it would take about maybe 50 to 100,000 trees that you'd need to plant over the next 15 years, and do that every year just to try and mitigate that one website. So these are huge numbers, but it's important to acknowledge a couple of things. One, unlike flights, where it's 50 million flights a year or whatever there are, so in individual airlines and individual flights are massive contributors. No one individual person or even company, therefore, when you think about splitting it, dividing that footprint by trillions of interactions, is therefore necessarily having a meaningful impact, that the emissions of that website were a fraction of a percent of the overall carbon footprint of that telco. So they are very small, but they have a cumulative effect. And I think it's also important to call out and talk about the carbon benefits of digital footprints. So what we're doing right now is an obvious and easy example. Okay, this has quite a high digital carbon footprint because we're all here watching me wave my arms around, and it's pumping the video down in as high a definition as anybody can get squeezed through their bandwidth at home or wherever they are. And if I was clever enough, I could have maybe done some rough numbers, but it will be high. It will be gigabytes of data transfer. It will be potentially kilograms of CO2 emissions that we are pumping out because of this webinar. But we have lots of data, particularly through what happened with COVID, to prove demonstrably that technologies like this have a huge offline carbon benefit in comparison to us all jumping on the train and traveling and getting together, lovely as that is. So there's a spectrum of digital where it can have offline carbon benefits, and then at the other end of the spectrum, TikTok, Netflix, other things like that, where the benefits are entertainment or whatever it is, marketing. But you need to kind of think where you are on that spectrum. So I think my point in the brief few minutes I've had, and I'll shut up really, is just it's really important to get everybody thinking about them. Measuring them is hard. There are different methodologies, but there are some great tools out there. I don't know if we can post a link maybe afterwards I would call out the Green Pages, which is a resource that we put together. It's just a curation. It's a low carbon website with a curated set of resources for anyone involved in digital, creatives, technology people, with a set of measuring tools and best practices. It's a lovely sort of site, and there are measuring tools on there for you to get started. So we can all start reducing our carbon footprints by thinking about building lower carbon websites. It's really easy to do. Lower carbon streaming adverts and media, again, really easy to do, relatively simple to measure it once you buy into the methodology. There are also things, I was talking to this group earlier. I saw a lovely example on the Octopus website the other day, where you can actually make the experiences dynamic based on how much energy is coming onto the grid at any given time. So a cool example would be like a smart air conditioning system that adapted itself if there wasn't much wind and renewable energy on the grid during the day. But I saw on Octopus, I really like this one. I was on it browsing their website, and their little octopus character came onto the corner of the screen and said, "Hey, your laptop's over 70% charged, and there's not a lot of wind and solar energy on the grid right now. Why don't you unplug it?" And I did, and I felt really lovely about myself. I don't know whether it had any impact, especially if I plugged it back in that evening. But all these tiny little things add up. So we can all start to think about reducing our digital footprints, which is, by the way, a lovely way to talk to kids about addiction to smartphones and things like that. We're trying to work in schools to sort of educate them about this sort of stuff as well, if you have kids. We can reduce our digital footprints as individuals and as companies with the solutions that we're building. We can think about the offline benefits and talk to our consumers about that, and that's an interesting one to debate in terms of mail and digital and how we market things. And then there's this kind of real-time dynamic experiences, and all of these, when you add them up across trillions of interactions, would have an enormous impact. I'll leave you with a nice example of, why doesn't Netflix have a green mode? Okay, why does it force us to watch the highest bandwidth it can pump down into our homes? Wouldn't it be lovely if it just said you could run it in green mode and it reduces the bandwidth, reduces the emissions, and at the end of the month said, hey, thanks for watching, here's some shows you might like, and here's how many kilograms you've saved. And watch everybody copy, but everybody can think about their green mode, and it will have a huge additive effect.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Jane. Fascinating. The thing that's, when we've been on this journey, what stood out for me was that point you made at the beginning about the internet has a bigger carbon footprint than the aviation industry. It's just something that, until you're told that, you just don't think about it. And it's interesting that as an industry, and your work through BIMA, that you starting to look at ways and innovative ways of reducing it. But the point is, it does have a footprint. And in fact, everything has a footprint. And part of what Royal Mail Marketreach are doing with this is looking at ways that you can suggest to people to design out some of the bad habits or some of the bad impacts and design in some of the benefits and innovations that are happening. And so I was going to turn to you, Charles, and talk to us a little bit about that segment of the supply chain where you've got paper and it's into the printing and production, and what innovations or steps forward is your area taking to be more sustainable?
Well, it's a really good question, and that segment is an enormous segment. The print industry is a £13 billion sector. Mailing distribution is a big part of it. We've got the whole packaging sector, which I know we're not talking about today. In terms of how the industry is moving forwards, there's so many things going on. I mean, we talk about the substrates and the paper. It's very easy to think, well, because paper comes from trees, it's therefore bad news. And the reality, as Jim said, it's highly recyclable. We've got the highest recycling rate, I think, in the UK, across Europe, something like 73% of paper is recycled, over 80%. So the substrate is highly recyclable. It comes from harvested forests. So there's a very keen awareness of the need to manage that part of the resource chain really, really carefully. And actually, one could probably talk for hours about that. I suppose I want to talk more about the production side of things and what's going on there. I would say the biggest difference really is how the world of particularly commercial print has changed. We've moved away, because of the massive change in how we all consume information, from high volume generic print, basically, whether that's magazines or other forms. And the really exciting, interesting about print is how it works really closely together with digital to be highly effective. Both work really closely and well together. The innovations in our industry are much more about integrating with data. They're about targeting, using digital print particularly, to get the right bit of print to the right people at the right time. And it's an amazingly effective channel there. And really overall here, what we're talking about is not doing things wastefully, however that is. So that change is hugely significant. In terms of what's going on the sort of equipment side of things, all the major equipment providers are massively focused on sustainability, and particularly with this move towards shorter run and digital. So digital presses are, it's the sort of unique single copy production they can do highly effectively. But actually, even in the offset side of things, I would say the more traditional side, but actually that production method is very, very effective at very low runs now, and the efficiency improvements there are just off the scale when it comes to modern equipment. So turnarounds are much faster, energy is recycled much more effectively, those presses are much more energy effective. So it's really ongoing innovation across the production side of things. We're a trade association, as you know. Part of our role is to talk to government actually about what government can do to help us support the sector. And a lot of that is about making the UK a really great place to invest and helping SMEs invest in modern production technology. And then sort of moving beyond that, you've got things that again, we do as an association. We've got an environmental roadmap. So we work with the supply chain. See, everyone's got roadmaps now, haven't they? But we work with the supply chain to give a complete toolkit of things that companies can do, because we recognize that running commercial organizations, it can be quite tough, actually. And what we've seen historically is that environmental initiatives have been knocked off track by recessions. And it's pretty clear that that is not going to happen this time. And it was pretty clear, actually, even going back a few years ago, that wasn't going to be the case. But what we've needed to do is make sure that we recognize that actually people work incredibly hard to stay in business and to make money. And actually, the environmental steps that people can take are entirely consistent with running more efficient and effective production sites. It is reducing waste. It's looking at solar. We've got great networks looking at the implementation of solar. It's managing emissions. It's all those different steps that are entirely consistent with good business practice and with improved environmental performance. So if I was going to kind of sum up, really what it's about is it's about ongoing incremental improvement against the backdrop of a massively changed media landscape.
Brilliant. Well, it's fascinating and interesting to hear all of the different steps that you're taking. I think what we're seeing then, if I hear this right, is that there's a sort of shift from that sort of linear model where almost we don't care about the consequences, take, make, waste, and be done with it, to a much keener awareness of the whole system and the whole circular impact of the printing and production side of it. And on that note, I was going to bring you in here, Hannah, just to talk to us a little bit about, now I know this concept of circularity. I'm sure everybody's is aware of it and is familiar with it, but we perhaps don't know too much about it. Maybe if we take a step back and hear from you a little bit about what does it mean, and how could Mail possibly play into and contribute to more to a circular economy?
Thank you. Yeah. Hi. With regards to the circular economy, I think part of the reason that this debate is quite interesting is because some of the topics already covered get to the heart of some of the, I guess, the challenges that we talk about and misconceptions around the circular economy and what its purpose is. So, at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, we see the circular economy as really a means, or the how for how you tackle climate change ultimately. And that's why it's quite exciting to see some of the work that Marketreach have been doing on that life cycle, because 45% of carbon emissions come from how our products and services are actually produced. So it's fairly easy to have a debate about moving to renewable energy, and you can see how we could quite easily transition to a lower carbon economy in that sense. But that would really only tackle half of the problem. If we move to renewable energy sources, we still need to think about, where are our materials sourced from? What happens to them at the end of life? How are we making sure that we're preserving all of the natural resources on the earth and making sure that they're kind of used in perpetuity in a way that supports, the biodiversity of the planet and human life ultimately. And I should say that I definitely empathize with the question around arguing for different media mixes and which is better, because I come from a media and planning background, but made the shift about 5 years ago to work on the circular economy via a leadership program called On Purpose for the sustainability sector. And I think why the circular economy is really important to me over, for example, tackling climate change specifically, is that holistic view that it gives of our economy, and that alternative pathway for businesses to transition and really think about, everything that they're doing, from where they're sourcing their materials from to how they operate their business models, to what happens to products and services at the end of their life. And so to talk about what the circular economy is more broadly, so there's sort of three principles to a circular economy. The first is to eliminate waste. So making sure that 80% of waste is actually created in the actual design and concept of products. So we want to make sure that in a circular economy, products and services are designed so that waste is reduced and eliminated at the end of their life. The second principle is ensuring that materials are kept in circulation as long as possible throughout their lifespan. So moving from a model where we're encouraging people to buy more and more products at the end of the life to making sure that products are kept in circulation, that they're repaired, they're maintained, and they're restored. And thirdly, and maybe the one that's maybe not, well, one of the most important, but is probably the least talked about, is in a circular economy, we want to ensure that our natural ecosystems are being used in a way that they're regenerated and contributing to the biodiversity and health of the planet. And I think one of the most common misconceptions about a circular economy, and hopefully what those 3 principles shows, is that it's just about recycling. And if you can recycle plastics, if you can recycle paper, then you kind of that's most of the job done. But actually, in a circular economy, recycling should be the last resort. Obviously, it depends a little bit on the product and on the material that you're using. And paper can be reused and recycled multiple times, particularly if it's designed in a way that allows it to be easily recycled. But the ideally we want products and services to be kept in circulation as long as possible in order to reduce their impact. But the journey and optimum life cycle for products really depends on what they're made out of. And there's sort of 2 cycles in a circular economy. One we refer to as the technical cycle, and one the biological cycle. The technical cycle refers to products and services that are made out of, I guess, like materials that cannot be regenerated. So stones, metals, things like that. And the biological cycle refers to products that are made out of materials that can be regenerated, such as wood, food, wool. But in both cases, what's important in a circular economy is that all products are designed to ensure that the maximum value is extracted and captured during the design and production process as possible. So that can mean like laptops being designed to be taken apart at the end of their life, or thinking about peel from food waste. How can you use that to develop different food sources and products rather than letting it go to landfill? So I have to say, for me, like as somebody working in the circular economy, it is really exciting to see some of the advances in research and the sort of the holistic approach that Marketreach have taken into to making mail more circular, particularly thinking about things like using EV vans, using biodegradable inks so that paper can be more recycling. Because I think in order to move to a circular economy, it's really that mindset shift that's required, and doing things like life cycle analysis really help you think more holistically about the impact of your business in multiple different ways. But I think it's also important to say that I don't think we're at a point where we can say, digital or mail is more sustainable or more circular, because we're still at a very sort of early stage in the transition to a circular economy, and nobody is doing things perfectly yet. We're still just, we're still iterating, we're still trying things out, we're still innovating. And so we need a lot more collaboration and sharing across different industries and within sectors to bring that about. And an example of this, well, it's really great to think about getting paper from sustainable resources, but in a circular economy, we really need to think about moving from sustainable forestry to regenerative forestry, because although there's a lot of sustainable forests, for example, in the UK, the sort of biodiversity of our woodlands has been in decline for 40 years. And we need to think about not just sort of replanting trees, things like that, but also thinking about the biodiversity of soils, thinking about how the use of forests, thinking about how you improve, habitats for animals. It requires a much more holistic approach to really to get there. And that's not to say that, the advances and things being done are not positive and are not a step in the right direction, but there's just so much to a circular economy. It really is. It requires a kind of a whole different way of thinking. It's a much more of a systemic way of thinking rather than, I guess, a reductionist way of thinking, which our current linear economy encourages us to do. And so there's lots of things that need to be considered. So if you're using EV vans, which are much more sustainable in terms of when they're in use than combustion engines, because they last for on average 100 years. But are there ways that these vans can be more productive? Can they be rented out or kept in use for a longer time? What happens to them at the end of their life? How is their, when they're being built, what are the emissions and the processes involved in that? There's so much to it. And in the digital advertising space as well, like there's the obvious thing around carbon emissions and 3% of total global emissions coming from these data centers. But, again, back to that point around regenerating natural landscapes, and something else that digital advertisers or these data centers need to think about the actual space that they take up, and how they're thinking about how they're interacting with their local community, how they're interacting with the space that they're taking up. Are they designing their facilities to be as nature positive as possible? Because there's a lot of work and a lot of thought in this space at the moment around how you design buildings and facilities to become more nature positive, because buildings are currently responsible for 39% of global energy related to carbon emissions, and 11% of that comes from the materials and construction. So that's something that all advertisers, all kind of businesses need to think about as well. And then the other thing, maybe this is a bit too broad to take it for this debate, but the other question really is around the impact of what you're advertising. If you're a marketeer, for example, I sit on a committee for a community-run farm in South London, and we use direct mail to attract new customers to our veg box scheme, which is, and all of our veg is grown in a very sustainable way that regenerates the soil and, has multiple other benefits on the community. And so you can argue that, if that becomes then a healthy, thriving business, that the impact of that is going to outweigh the carbon footprint or the footprint of the marketing that it took to get us there. So it's important to think about that as well. And aside from ethical considerations, I think advertisers also need to be thinking about how other business models and how their clients' business models will be changing, in a circular economy. So for an economy to become circular requires businesses to think a little bit more about, different ways of operating, different business models. For example, we're seeing a lot more businesses, particularly in the sort of the clothes and retail space, develop kind of rental models which require customers to return products to the business where they got them from. And ultimately that requires kind of much more localized supply chains and smaller loops. So that's, in terms of thinking about direct mail or how you advertise, that's going to have a huge impact as well that advertisers need to think about. So I guess to come back to the question about sort of at hand around, wood-based economy versus pixels or mail versus digital, I think we're still really very much at the start of the journey. And I don't think we're at the point where we can say which is better. But what we can do and what we try to do at the foundation, and hopefully what this webinar is encouraging, is collaborations and learnings across different sectors and within industries to try and accelerate the transition to a circular economy in a sort of a hopeful future ultimately. But I think it's really, really exciting to be having this discussion, and I think it's great to see that the work that Marketreach have been doing, and I just look forward to seeing you continue on your journey, I guess.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Hannah. And for anybody who hasn't been to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website and seen some of the amazing resources that you've got there, I urge you to do that and in that way. But Phil, turning to you, I mean, Hannah's laid a bit of a challenge down there, talking about businesses that are reinventing themselves, that are how could we pose that question to you? And it'd be interesting to hear about what Royal Mail and Marketreach are doing in your business to try and contribute or accelerate the transition to more of a circular-based business, and particularly for the mail channel itself.
Of course, yeah. Thank you, Richard. So good morning, everyone. So I guess the answer to that question is a lot of different things. So yeah, we have as you would imagine, as any large organization, we have a pretty extensive ESG strategy. We'll probably focus more on the environmental aspects today, based on the kind of nature of the conversation. But if you think about Royal Mail as an employer, we employ 1 in 175 people across the UK. So we have a significant footprint and visibility as a brand, and trust is at the heart of everything we do. And as an organization, we are hugely passionate about playing our part in supporting the government's ambitions and the global ambitions to I guess, achieve the requirements that we need to as a kind of a global population to meet climate challenges. So our ESG strategy aligns with kind of government targets, about 1.5% increase in kind of temperatures across the globe. And I guess, if you think about things like the E on the ESG and the environmental aspect, then we have a very clear ambition to be net zero as a business. That we anticipate achieving by kind of 2040. I wouldn't get too hung up on 2040 or 2035. So to give you an idea, we brought forward that ambition by 10 years in the last 12 months, and it moves. And the reason for that is because we are passionate about being net zero as a business in terms of what we do and how we operate. And going back to Hannah's point, a lot of the technology and solutions that will enable us as a business to get there aren't quite fully developed or are emerging, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But they have quite a significant impact, I guess, on what those timelines are. So we're passionate about reorganizing and basically redesigning the way that our organization works to make sure that we contribute and deliver a sustainable operational business moving forward. So we do that in 4 ways, really. So our ambitions, really, to be clear, is we want a net zero delivery model. We want to be net zero from an operational processing perspective. We want to make circular happen. And as Hannah pointed out earlier, collaboration for action is really important. So I guess in terms of our strategy, really, it's all about what can we do as a business, how can we work as an industry together to make that happen, how can we help brands make the right decisions and help them really make decisions that have a positive impact, and often case by just doing small things for education. So if you take things like net zero delivery as an example, we're probably already the least carbon footprint in the kind of parcels market that we operate. But effectively, you would have seen, and Hannah mentioned earlier, a number of things that we're doing. So whether that's introducing EV fleets for delivery. So we have the largest EV network in the UK of any organisation, and we're rolling out EV deliveries across the UK. We're trialling lots of different delivery mechanisms. So, and I'll probably get the terminology wrong, but little things like carts to use. Are we using electric bikes in certain central locations? Even things like drone delivery, we are kind of testing. So we are constantly exploring technologies that will enable us to kind of reduce the delivery. And obviously, we've got 90,000 post people who are out every single day, powered by human power, don't require any electricity. And obviously, we're keen to kind of continually reinvent that process to look at how we can make that more efficient. If you then look at things like, our operations, we already have 100% renewable electricity across our network in terms of our operational processes, but we're constantly looking at our kind of footprint from a kind of building perspective. We're looking at kind of our vehicle networks that we operate across the country, and also how we move mail, for example, around the country. So again, we are making changes, for example, to the way that we work. So one of the things that we have been exploring for a while is whether, for example, we can get all of our frontline staff to start an hour later and finish an hour later. And the reason for that is that effectively that would enable us to remove or reduce significantly the amount of traffic we fly around the country to meet service standard levels. So things like that can have a significant impact. But it comes back to the point we'll talk a little bit about in a minute about collaboration, is that change can be difficult. It affects lots of different people and lots of different processes. So collaboration of change is really important to make these things happen and work in that context. And then things like, again, in terms of product specifications, how we specify products, how they're sorted to us. Do we have things in bags or trays? How do we redesign the equipment that we use? So things like, for example, we don't use as many bags as we used to in the past because it's all now trade, which are all recycled, all reused constantly rather than kind of bags that have a shorter life. But we've kind of re-engineered those bags to make them more sustainable. We've re-engineered the ties that tie the bags together. And we've looked at all sorts of things like, for example, first-time delivery. So, example, if we can deliver items that are a bit bulkier that can't go through letterboxes, for example, first time, it means that we don't have to deliver those items that have a kind of create an additional carbon footprint. So, we've developed capability through things like our app to make sure that people receive items when they're in. And it means that we have to kind of re-deliver less things. So there's less kind of re-carbon created by non-first delivery. And then I guess the final point, and it is really around collaboration. So, working really extensively across the industry to look at how we can improve processes, how we can make change quicker across organizations. So we work with organizations like Charles's and through things like the Strategic Mailing Partnership that represents the print industry, really looking at how, we talked about how we map our carbon footprint as an industry, but also how do we then identify the things that we can do to reduce that? How can we support things like circularity by redesigning processes and making products easier to meet kind of recycling standards and capabilities in the UK? And then through that kind of activities, then create guidance and advice for brands, really about things that they can do practically around stuff, and also to help, I guess, challenge some of the kind of misconceptions or perceptions that people have about print in totality, and what the differences are between different types of print or different types of paper, and what that impacts on the carbon perspective. So the more informed we can make brands to make best decisions, the kind of better products I think we will have in our network to deliver, and the quicker we'll reduce carbon, I guess, across the kind of infrastructure. So transparency is really important for us, and I think it's really important to try and help people make the right decisions, and also for us to kind of focus as an industry around things that can make big differences and significant differences, and help support our kind of stakeholders that support and sit around that processes. So, you know, in a separate guise, I sit on the board of Code of Advertising Practice. So most marketers will be aware of things like the environmental standards. You know, and there's kind of often two schools of thought on things like regulation. One is around, are they sets of rules that just make brands jump higher? But I do think, the role of the CAP is really about trying to create sensible guidelines that really help brands. So, we see a lot in our own research that we do with consumers around their misconceptions or just lack of understanding around sustainability and things they can do practically. And it's because things change. So labeling on products, and Charles hasn't talked a lot about product packaging, but there's a lot of conceptions around what is recyclable, what's not recyclable, can I put that in my recycling bin or not? And we have to help consumers educate and make better decisions, and understand and give them confidence that the decisions they're doing are the right decisions to make. There's quite a lot of things in a nutshell, but as an organisation, we are passionate about our journey to net zero, and obviously our broader impact as an organisation on the society that we operate in the UK.
Brilliant. Thanks, Phil. That, as you said, covered enormous amount of ground there. And I'll just a shout out to the question box. If this is your chance to ask probing and difficult questions of this panel, so please put your questions in the box, and we'll come to those in a second. So just to kick that off, I was going to come back to you, Phil, and say, I think we agree with what Hannah said and what you said, that it's almost the wrong question to say, is mail a more sustainable choice? It's actually, of course, we can all imagine some horrible examples of plastics and bad behaviors. And so what we're actually saying, I think what you're saying, is that it can be a good sustainable choice. It can be part of an effective marketing mix. It can work with digital brilliantly if people make the right choices in the way that they develop their mail campaigns. So my question to you, Phil, was just to talk a little bit about your vision for mail in the years. You're obviously going through a lot of transition and doing a lot of work in this area. What's your vision from how mail can contribute? How do you see it unfolding in the next few years in terms of what it can be part of a more circular economy?
So I think I guess there's two angles to that. So one angle is around how the products are produced, and they're kind of going back to Hannah's conversation about circularity. It's how do we as an industry, with our users of mail, create products that create or support the kind of circular economy happen. So that's everything from how do we reduce impacts across print, inks, production, delivery, processing, and how do we kind of make gains in all of those areas? Some areas will be quicker than others to do, but effectively, I think the industry is passionate about its impact and what it can do. So it is an industry that is constantly innovating, and the amount of innovation, I think, across the print industry is significant. And one of our challenges, I think, as an industry, is about how we sell that story or tell that story more vocally. And how, so that's one kind of aspect, I think, in terms of what we do from that perspective. And I think the second point, I think, is about how do we help brands then make the right decisions. So not only in terms of how they go about producing the items, but how they use their mail as part of their overall communication strategy or communication mix. So lots of conversations I have with brands today will talk about if I compare this media versus this media. But again, if you think about the superpowers of mail, and one of the challenges, again, from an industry perspective, is that mail has, mail is different to things like email, as an example. So we know that it has a much greater frequency, a much more longer engagement scenario, it has a much more attention. So you do send less of it. to get the same outcome. So when we think about media planning as an example, it's about helping brands in the context of media planning understand, well, actually, to get the same outcome of a mail item, I might only be sending one item, but I might be sending 8, for example. So this isn't about whether email or mail is right, but it's about trying to get people to understand that actually the combined effect of kind of multi-channel, multi-touch points creates more and more carbon in that process. So if we can improve brands' experiences with that, if we can make sure the communications arrive at the right time with the right messaging on it and are more relevant for brands, then effectively we also reduce wastage as an industry in the advertising market. And there's lots of discussion you will see through things like the Advertising Association around things like excess frequency that goes on kind of on certain channels or different contexts. But equally, that has a negative impact on the advertising industry. And this is what drives kind of reductions in trust. So again, coming back to my point earlier around, how do we help consumers make right decisions? Over years, consumers will have received different messages around different things, and some of those are contradictory. So I think the advertising industry as a whole and our industry, playing into that, has a great opportunity, I think, to re-educate and re-baseline consumer perception as well as our own perception about how we use different media for what purposes and what impact it actually creates.
Brilliant. Yeah. And then, Hannah, I was going to turn to you. You're you've got a background in media and you understand the issues very well, but more generous view on circularity. When you listen to the things that James and Charles Phil have been talking about, are you optimistic? Do you feel that this is, or do you worried that we're not moving fast enough in the right direction? Or are you encouraged in what you hear in terms of what people are up to? Do you think we're moving fast enough in the right direction?
I guess both. Yeah, I don't think we're moving fast enough. No, but I am optimistic. I guess there's quite a lot of theories of change about how change happens and how how systemic change happens, and there's a lot of thought about how it can be very gradual at the beginning and then kind of accelerate. But I think there's so many different. I think it's hard for businesses. We see it with our with the people that we work with in our network, because it requires in a lot of cases making a lot of upfront investment or investing things that can be quite costly in the short term. And if your competitors aren't doing the same, or there's a real balance to strike there between maintaining your business in the short term and making it sustainable in the long run. So I think it's really important to work with policymakers to we have this not in the wood-based economy area, but at the moment we have a global coalition that we're bringing together to create a global treaty around plastic pollution, because without kind of the right policy or the right things to make the playing field level for businesses, it's really hard for them to make the right choices. So but I do feel like everybody, and as a foundation we're kind of encouraged and less encouraged, because when we've only been running 10 years, and when we first started people really didn't have a clue what the circular economy was, or a lot of our time was spent explaining it, and now we're moving to a phase where people are like, okay, we get it, but how do we actually do that, which is encouraging. But this is also this is the sticky stuff, right? This is where it gets really, really hard. So I think it's encouraging. I think the other challenge is, I think what's also hard for businesses is treading that line between talking about what you're doing and celebrating successes, but not greenwashing. But also on the other side, there's a lot of talk around if you do make claims that, or and you're not, I don't know, if you do make claims, you can be subject to attacks from groups that are can accuse you of greenwashing. So there's then all of the other way. You have green hushing, which is a term that I've come to learn in the last, where people don't want to talk about what they are doing for fear of being accused of not doing enough. But the fact is nobody's doing things perfectly. So what we want to do is encourage conversations that are honest and encourage people to share their successes and failures. So that was quite a long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's very interesting to hear. And Charles, to sort of throw a similar sort of question to you, there's a question in the chat about would you point to one key advance or innovation that you're aware of that's coming down the track or already in place that gives you optimism from the perspective of your industry?
I'm going to step back a tiny bit from that and say, am I optimistic? Yes, massively so. Are we making real progress? Yes, massively so. We can always do better and do more, though. The reason I'm optimistic, though, is that when I look at what's happened within our environmental group, it is by far the most active and collaborative group. It's moved from a place of people seeing strong environmental performance as a competitive advantage through to, you know what, we just should be doing it, we should be sharing it. And I think that energy is coming both from individuals, it's coming from companies, and actually clients are demanding it as well. In terms of innovations, it's really hard to pick out one, but probably where we start is this measurement and baselining point, actually. And I think, as I mentioned, we can see the tools coming through now to do that well. We can see that whilst there is room for debate around the standards, because there are always lots of standards out there, these tools are getting accredited much, much better. And I saw a tool last week, actually, at an organization that looked really impressive and addressed this really difficult question about measuring carbon footprinting across the entire supply chain. So I'd pick out that one, but that's against a backdrop of enormous innovation in a really high-tech industry. It really is.
Well, it's interesting. There's sort of two common themes in the question box. One is about benchmarking and data, and the other is about tools and how we can help. Because I do believe that most people are, want to do the right thing, and they just need the guidance, the data, and the support and some direction to make the right choices. And so, just because we're going to need to wrap up quite quickly, I'm just going to point to a couple of those. If I bring the slides back up, Sean. There we go. That's the right one. Excellent. Just a couple of things that, well, first of all, to go back and to say this, that I think it's incredibly innovative what Marketreach have done in terms of a proper life cycle assessment and then publishing that data in its full, in its entirety for marketeers to use and to make informed choices about mail formats and delivery mechanisms. So there is starting to be a currency of data and a how should we say, a way of benchmarking activity. Now, yes, somebody put a question, shouldn't we have an industry-wide common currency if we can compare apples with apples? Absolutely. I don't think we're there yet, but I think this is the LCA, the life cycle assessment that Marketreach has done, is a fantastic and innovative step forward to publish that data. You can lean in with your phone and capture that QR code, which will take you to a plethora of resources, including the LCA data for mail, plus several guides to how you can start to think about integrating more sustainable choices into developing mail campaigns. So that QR code, if it doesn't work off your screen, there is also, next slide, there's a website, marketreach.co.uk/mail-sustainability, where all these resources are available to you. Similarly, I shout out to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website. There's an enormous amount of material there. The BIMA stuff that James does is incredibly informative from a digital perspective. And obviously, Charles, through the BPIF, there's an enormous wealth of stuff that people can look at and find in that way. So if I've got 30 seconds left just to sort of summarize where we've got to today, is that the question before us is not, is mail more or less sustainable in comparison? That's the wrong question. I think the question we quite rightly pose is, can it be considered a sustainable option if we make the right choices, if we make informed decisions in thinking through how to source the right materials, print them in the right way, deliver them in a low carbon way, and make sure that we're encouraging good consumer behaviors to recycle, reuse, repurpose some of that material, to make sure that that's designed into our mail channel from the get-go. Thank you to everyone for joining this webinar, and thank you to Marketreach for sponsoring this DMA event. It will be available as a recording thereafter. But if you have any follow-up questions, do get in touch. Thank you.